Hackers exploit vulnerabilities to break into computer systems. These vulnerabilities can be either hardware or software. And there is also another type of vulnerability, which is the human vulnerability. In the first part of this video, we will define what a vulnerability is and give an idea of it. In the second part of this video, we will talk about privileges. As we'll see, when hackers get into a system by exploiting a vulnerability, they get privileges on the system. And these privileges give hackers the ability to perform their malicious action. So let's start by defining what a vulnerability is. A vulnerability is a weakness in the information system that can be exploited for a cyber attack. Vulnerabilities can be in the software or in the malware. They are due to software bugs or hardware malfunctions. And as I told you, there is also this human vulnerability that is very often exploited by attackers. And in this course, we'll mostly consider attacks exploiting either the software or the human vulnerability. We will not consider attacks exploiting hardware vulnerabilities. So to give you an idea of what a vulnerability is, I will use a textbook case of a software vulnerability that existed in the VNC application. And the vulnerability is also described in the link given in this slide. I think many of you know what the VNC application is. It's a client-server application in which the server is installed on an end user's computer and the client is installed on a computer owned by an administrator. This application is mainly used for the remote administration of users' computers. An administrator connecting to a VNC server installed on a user computer must authenticate himself. This VNC application was found to have a critical vulnerability. Basically, an attacker could take full control of the user's computer without authenticating. So before describing the vulnerability, let's first describe the normal behavior of the application. So first, the administrator sends a connection request to the remote computer. The VNC server asks for a password. The administrator provides this password. And finally, the VNC server gives the administrator access to the remote computer. And the administrator can intervene on the remote computer. So this is the normal behavior of the VNC application. Let us now look at the vulnerability that existed in this VNC application. Actually, in the previous slide, I didn't go into detail. The point I did not mention is that the server was supposed to tell the client how to authenticate. By providing a password, by providing a certificate, or even by providing no credentials, that is, by not authenticating. And the client was supposed to confirm and respect the authentication method imposed by the server. Unfortunately, the server, and this was the bug, the vulnerability, the server did not verify that the client was following the authentication instructions. So first, the hacker sends a connection request. The server selects the authentication mode for which it has been configured. Assume it has been configured to ask the client to provide a password. Okay, you can see here that the server asks the client to provide a password. The attacker does not respect the instructions and selects the mode No Authentication. Okay, the attacker selects the mode No Authentication. It's a bit silly that the client has to select an authentication mode, but the VNC application was programmed in that way. Surprisingly, the attacker is granted access to the remote computer.
In fact, the server, and this is a critical bug, the server does not verify that the authentication mode selected by the client matches the authentication mode it itself selected. So this was a small example to give an idea of a software vulnerability. That one was a very serious vulnerability, easy to discover and to exploit. Very often the vulnerabilities are more difficult to detect and to exploit. When a vulnerability in a given piece of software has been exploited several times during several cyber attacks, the software editor is alerted and eventually fixes the vulnerability. The VNC vulnerability that we presented can no longer be exploited. It has been fixed in more recent versions of the VNC application. Maybe an attacker can find a computer on which a very old version of the VNC application is installed and continue to exploit this vulnerability. But with time, this becomes more and more unlikely. This means that a newly discovered vulnerability is something very valuable because it has not yet been fixed. In fact, to an attacker, a newly discovered vulnerability is like a treasure. A newly discovered vulnerability is called zero-day vulnerability. If the software publisher becomes aware of the vulnerability, it must act as quickly as possible to fix it. And this is the reason why we have so many operating system updates for computers or mobile phones to fix newly discovered vulnerabilities. A cyber attack exploiting a zero-day vulnerability is simply called a zero-day attack. And I told you that zero-day vulnerabilities are so valuable that cyber criminals and intelligence agencies are constantly looking for zero-day vulnerabilities. There is even an underground market for these vulnerabilities. And the price of a zero-day vulnerability can be very high. Sometimes software companies reward people themselves for discovering new vulnerabilities in their software. The US National Security Agency, an intelligence agency, has been criticized for accumulating zero-day vulnerabilities without revealing them to software publishers. This, of course, with the intention to use these vulnerabilities in espionage operations. We humans are part of information systems. Therefore, we can be the target of a cyber attack. And unfortunately, we are a very weak component of the information system. We are very easy to deceive simply because our human nature leads us to trust rather than to be suspicious. And the consequence is that today, attacks exploiting human vulnerability are in the majority. And we'll talk about attacks exploiting the human vulnerability later in this course.
So I think now you have an idea of what a vulnerability is. When an attacker exploits a vulnerability, it is because he is planning to perform a malicious action. And the malicious action that the attacker can perform depends on the privileges that the attacker has gained by exploiting the vulnerability. So in the second part of this video, let's talk a little bit about these privileges.
When you use a computer, you have certain privileges as a user. These privileges are linked to your account. For example, they include the right to create or edit your own files, or to run certain applications. A synonym for privilege is right or permission. When you run a program, it becomes a process. And in general, this process inherits the privileges associated with your account. For example, the PowerPoint application I'm currently using inherits the privileges associated with my account. And of course, if I'm using an administrator account, the PowerPoint process will have more privileges than if I am using a regular account. In addition to user processes, there are also system processes. that is operating system processes. And they have their own privileges. And in general, these processes have as many privileges as administrators, if not more. When an attacker is planning a malicious action, he will try to obtain some privileges on the targeted system. Without privileges, he can't do anything. Whenever an attacker is granted privileges he is not entitled to, there is what is called a privilege escalation. And the malicious action that the attacker will be able to carry out will depend on his privileges. As we are going to see, there are several types of privilege escalation. In fact, there are two forms of privilege escalation: vertical privilege escalation and horizontal privilege escalation. Vertical privilege escalation occurs when a user gains privileges that are higher than the privileges he is currently holding. This means that privileges are in a way hierarchically organized. And the so-called set of privilege rings shows you this hierarchy. For example, if Bob goes from a privilege level corresponding to his account to a privilege level corresponding to an admin account, there is a vertical privilege escalation. In an horizontal privilege escalation, a regular user, that is a non-admin user, gains privileges that are reserved to another regular user. For example, if Bob goes from a privilege level corresponding to his account to a privilege level corresponding to Alice's account, then there is a horizontal privilege escalation. And as a matter of fact, in the VNC application that we have seen previously, the attacker started from a level without privilege on the targeted system and ended up with a privilege level corresponding to the account of the user currently connected to the remote computer. So this was a vertical privilege escalation. Last thing I want to say about privilege escalation is that very often an attacker will gain a high level of privilege in several steps. For example, the attacker will first try to obtain a privilege level of a regular user account, and then, in a second part of the attack, he will attempt to gain an admin privilege level.
So now you know that an attacker's first objective is to obtain the privileges required on the target system to carry out his malicious action. And the attacker will exploit a certain vulnerability to obtain these privileges. Finally, you have learned that privilege escalation refers to a change in the attacker's privilege level, either vertically or horizontally.